there's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamma Mia podcast.
Mamma Mia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters this podcast was recorded on. Hello, it's your host Gemma Bath jumping into your ears to tell you why this episode of True Crime Conversations sounds a little bit different. It's because we recorded it live at South by Southwest Sydney in October. I was joined by journalist and author Nicole Madigan to talk about her book Obsession and her experience of being stalked by her partner's ex-girlfriend. I interviewed Nicole in front of a live audience and we had a great conversation that I didn't want you to miss out on hearing, which is why we're releasing it for you to listen to today. Now, if you've heard Nicole's story before, it's because we did release an episode with her last year where Emma Gillespie talked to Nicole about the phenomenon of stalking. This episode dives much deeper into Nicole's own experience and the newest developments in her life, especially since her restraining order against her stalker lifted and the messages started back up, albeit much more sneakily. Let us know what you think of the conversation. Here it is. Hello, everyone. I'm Gemma Bath, host of True Crime Conversations, a Mamma Mia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. True crime is big business. According to recent insights into the podcasting landscape here in Australia, 45% of us are devoted to the industry, making it the most popular category. True Crime Conversations is regularly in the 20 most downloaded podcasts in the country, and it's our third most popular podcast at Mamma Mia. Mamma Mia, for those who don't know us, is Australia's largest independent women's media group, and it's ultimately our goal to make the world a better place for women and girls. So how do we do that while talking about crime on a podcast, you might ask? Well, true crime is traditionally a very male-dominated genre, one where women's stories can often be sensationalised and sometimes even laced with subtle misogyny. We make sure that women's voices are heard within their own narratives so that the horrible things that happen to them or that they're accused of doing to other people aren't just turned into trauma porn for the sake of telling a good story. With 30 million lifetime downloads, we at Mamma Mia interview everyone from detectives to victims to perpetrators, authors, podcasters and journalists about the biggest crimes of our generation. And we have a very special live episode to share with you today. Nicole Madigan is an author and journalist. She's also a colleague of mine at Mamma Mia. Nicole is also a victim survivor of stalking. And if that's a topic that is triggering for you, consider this your warning. Nicole's story starts in 2018 and it remains ongoing. Her experience is eye-opening and she's able to articulate the nuances of a crime that for so long have been misunderstood and underestimated in our country. Before we get to Nicole, as we always do on True Crime Conversations, allow me to set the scene. It's weirder when the guest is sitting with me. It's a stinking hot day in Brisbane in February 2018. And Nicole arrives at her inner-city apartment with her son Ben. They're meeting a group of his footy mates and their parents for an off-season sausage sizzle and some cricket. And Nicole is looking forward to escaping from her own thoughts with some small talk. She's currently in the final stages of leaving a 12-year marriage and starting a new life with her 3 young kids. It's messy and sad and strained. The day unfolds without a hitch until a woman who's been sitting off to the side asks, "Are you taking photos of Adam?" as she walks past, Adam being another dad at the gathering. The interaction is fleeting and a bit weird. "Taking photos of Ben," she replies, but the woman is already walking away. Later that night, she gets a Facebook message from a woman named Karissa Owens. "Hi, sorry, totally didn't mean anything by my comment. I thought you were taking photos for the footy page and I wanted you to take one of Adam getting bowled out by the kids. Ha ha. Anyway, really wanted to chat to you today." Weird, but okay. Nicole replies politely and moves on. But a week later, she gets another message, then another, and another, and another. This is the start of 5 years of pain and harassment from a woman who would eventually be charged with stalking. And Nicole joins us now. Nicole, that was the first message you got from Karissa at 9 o'clock at night after a day at the footy. What happened next?
Yeah, so after that night, I didn't give it a lot of thought. to be honest. And about a week later, I was at the shopping centre just minding my own business, and I got another text, a Facebook message, I should say, from the same person asking if I was married. And at that point, privately, I was going through a separation that had happened, but I hadn't told anyone about it. So I didn't want to talk about it to anyone, let alone a perfect stranger. Yeah. So I just kind of put it off and said, oh, why is that? And she said, oh, just wondering. And I let it go. And then a couple of days later, I got another message to the same effect, and I answered it in a similar kind of a way. And this happened 2 or 3 more times, and I mentioned it to my mum at one point, and she said, look, why don't you just tell, that guy from the footy, tell him that this woman is kind of sending you these messages? And because I had enough on my plate at that point. So that's what I did.
So you reached out to Adam, who you didn't really know.
No, not very well. We'd seen each other. He was a coach at the football club, so we had met and spoken briefly, but not in any kind of particularly friendly way.
And what was his reaction to you kind of telling him you'd been getting these weird messages?
Yeah, I sent it in a message as well. I didn't call him or anything like that. And he reacted sort of, I guess as you would expect, kind of sounded embarrassed, apologised. But I suppose he didn't sound as surprised or shocked as you might expect. So I just kind of thought, poor guy, this is embarrassing, but at least he knows, and hopefully I won't get any more messages.
Did he give you any context as to how he knew her?
Not at that time. I mean, my impression was that it was his girlfriend, but he had sort of said this kind of behaviour is why she's not in my life anymore, and left it at that. And I didn't pry because I didn't really know him at that point.
So Karissa's messages kind of died off. And in the meantime, you got chatting to Adam.
Yeah, I guess it was one of those things that just kind of happened organically. A few weeks after that, he sent me a message to check in and say, have you received any more of those messages, and apologise again. And I hadn't, of course, which is what I said. And we just sort of slowly developed a bit of a back and forth in messaging, which went over several weeks and months and developed from there.
And spoiler alert, fell in love.
Mm-hmm. We did, yeah.
So we skipped forward a year, and you hadn't heard from Karissa in this time. And it's AFL Grand Final Day. You remember that day very specifically.
Yeah.
September 2018. What happened? What changed?
Yeah, I remember the day really well because, as I mentioned, I had gone through a sort of ugly separation, which most separations are not pleasant. So it was difficult, and had really fallen into a nice, easy relationship with Adam and the kids, and we just started mixing the kids and things like that. So this was our first kind of event that we were hosting together.
So you had 3, he had 2.
Yeah.
One big happy
that's
family.
right. And we had other family members. My parents were there, and we had friends and things like that. So it was a really kind of poignant, special moment for me. So I remember it well. And at the end of that night, we were excited, and posted a couple of photos on Facebook and things like that. And late into that night, as we were doing the dishes and getting the kids to bed, I got this message request that was a really kind of vulgar and expletive-ridden message, and sort of that's where everything started to go wrong.
How regular did the messages become? Because, I read out one of those messages at the start. It was very vanilla, I guess. But these messages that you got a year later were anything but. I'll read one of the more tasteful ones out to you. He's using you to make me jealous. He still asks about me and my children. You sleep on my side of the bed. Ask him if he still has the pillow I bought for him. He always said he hates blondes. I'm assuming you were blonde at the time.
I was, yeah.
So this and the ones above are the kinds of messages you were getting. How regularly?
Yeah, so that particular night, I got a lot quite in a flurry, and Adam got a lot as well. And as you see, they were quite vulgar and ugly. So they were more at that stage, it was just an emotional response that I had. It was quite confronting, and I hadn't dealt with anything like that before. And making that night more sort of concerning, I suppose, was about an hour or two after I got those messages. I received a text message from my ex-husband just saying, Karissa says hi. That was just a really horrible feeling, because in that moment, all in one sort of night, I'd realised that this person was coming for me, and she'd also somehow contacted my ex-husband. From that point on, the messages came really regularly. So most days I would get them. Sometimes a few days would go by where there was a break, and then they would start again. But they were always in a flurry. So that ding, 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 that would come in a cluster.
I think all of us, obviously not in this same scenario, but know the fear of the ding if you don't want a ding. But how did it make you feel when it's starting to come every single day? And we're talking weeks, months. We're going to eventually start talking years. But in the start, when you weren't used to this and you started getting these dings at all hours of the day, how did it start to affect you?
Yeah, so that feeling with the dings changed obviously as time went on because the motivation behind those messages was becoming more concerning. But in those early days, I wasn't thinking stalking or anything like that. I was just found it all really confronting. It was really ugly and just confronting. So it upset me. I never knew when it was coming. They were really offensive. And I was starting to become, scared about what the motivation was because obviously there was sort of thinly veiled underlining threats there all the time too, that she was wanting to ruin my life essentially.
So what did you know about her at this point?
Well, not a lot, only what I'd spoken to Adam about. So he had told me that he had dated her and how things ended, and that was pretty much it. I didn't know anything else about her. I'd never met her or anything.
And you knew she was a mum, she had 2 kids, she lived in the same city?
Reasonably, yeah.
But beyond that, she was a stranger.
She was just a stranger to me.
You said that she started contacting your ex. She also started contacting your mum.
Yeah, so I'd gathered that she'd contacted my ex-husband, and then probably about 6 or so weeks into this, my mum called and said she had got a message request from this person as well. My mum and I are really close, so the content of the messages wasn't going to affect my relationship with my mum, but the intention behind that message was what I found frightening because it was full of lies. She'd sort of concocted a confrontation between us and a conversation and a little story there. So my fear at that point was if this happens to, a work colleague or, a client or something like that it could start to cause some damage.
When did you first decide to involve police?
It was quite a while in. I think it had been going on maybe sort of 8 or so months.
That's a long time.
Yeah, it is a long time. But it was just calling the police wasn't something that occurred to me. My mum had suggested it. She's a more cautious person. But at that point, I was just sort of putting my foot down and saying, I just don't want to feed this or give it attention. So I just didn't respond to anything and I didn't do anything essentially. The moment when I thought we should do something about it was when I received some messages where it had become evident that she'd created a profile in my name, a fake profile, and sent herself some messages from me and then sent all of those screenshots to Adam and told him that she'd be sending them around to my, work associates and family and friends and things like that. So to me, it had turned a little bit of a corner with impersonation and I thought now's the time to involve police.
So you didn't call the police station, you involved a cop that was a mate. So what did they suggest?
Yeah, so he said that often in cases like this, and this is very similar to the early stages of domestic violence cases, his advice was if you make an official complaint that you can't prove, it could inflame the situation and make the person angrier and make things worse. So, which is part of the problem with the way these sorts of issues are handled is you're essentially left to deal with it on your own. He did suggest, though, writing an email or contacting her in some way to warn her that we will take it further if the contact persists, which we did do.
And what happened?
So we drew up the email and sent it to her and then nothing. We were really excited. We were like, this is all we had to do. We just had to speak up and it's worked and it's done. And for about 4 or 5 months, it was total silence. But after that time, things started again, but in quite a different way.
And how was that?
Yeah, so what initially alerted me to her existence again was my son had been on a weekend with his father and he came home and said to me, Dad was talking to Karissa and unfortunately my ex-husband had told the children about this person. It was just part of that ugliness of the time. And I said, okay. And he said, I heard him say have you done the thing yet? And I didn't hear the answer. And I said, well, don't worry about it. I didn't want to talk to him about it, but it was sort of in my mind.
Ding, ding in the head.
And then a couple of days later, I got a text message from an unknown number, which was basically more of the same. They were sort of claiming to be someone else. They gave themselves a different name, but said all of the same sorts of things, the same sort of insults towards me and also Adam.
So it was Karissa, but instead of Facebook, she's gone to text.
Yeah, with an unknown number and saying that they were somebody else. But then I got several different numbers texting me with all of the same sorts of things.
Eventually, she also evolved to Instagram. Tell us about that evolution, because before that, it was all quite private. It's in your private text messages, in your private Facebook messages, and suddenly it's on Instagram.
Yeah, that's right. I guess I remember that moment really well because we were getting ready to move house. We'd bought our first house together, so we were quite excited and we were packing up my old house. And it was while I was doing that, I got an Instagram notification. And at that point, those notifications weren't giving me that horrible feeling of dread, because this was something that seemed completely separate to her world, from my understanding. But she had tagged me in a post, and it's really difficult to describe because it sounds so almost juvenile, but it was just a really insulting kind of ugly post using my name and just kind of, I guess, putting down my physical appearance and a few other things like that. And that's when I thought, oh my gosh, she's going public with this. And I ran out to tell Adam, and it stayed public from that moment on.
So she just kind of moved straight to Instagram.
Yes.
And her page kind of became just a target at you.
It literally became just a series of posts about me.
I know that you said you didn't know much about this woman, but obviously this far in, we're like a year in at this point, you did start doing a little bit more digging. What did you find on the internet about her?
It was kind of difficult because when I put her name in, nothing much came up. She didn't have much there at all. I knew where she worked, and that was about it. But at one point, I was just sitting there just feeling sort of lost about all of this, and I put in her phone number. I had seen it in Adam's blocked numbers, so I put it in. I don't know if they still have these, but at that point in time, they had these websites that warned you about spam numbers and things like that, where people sort of put in, oh, don't answer this number because it's a spam caller or whatever. Anyway, her phone number had come up, and there were several warnings from people saying that this is Karissa. I'd met her on Plenty of Fish or another dating site, and stay away because once she latches onto you, she starts to stalk and harass you, and she's been kicked off several times. So at that point, I'm thinking, okay, so she's done this before, and I sort of felt mixed feelings about that, a little sort of relieved that it wasn't just me, but also a bit alarmed that what does this mean?
She had a history.
Yeah.
I want to articulate because, like you were saying, it's kind of hard to explain how much this can permeate into your life. But she was interrupting really special moments between you and your kids and your stepkids and your partner, who it was a pretty fresh relationship. How much did this affect your relationship and your kids and the world you were creating?
Well, it affected me internally quite a lot. I tried to shield the people around me from how much it was impacting me, and that was for a couple of reasons. One was I didn't want it to impact my relationship on principle. I didn't want to be doing what she wanted me to do, which was fall apart. It's sort of a strange feeling because you feel like on the one hand, I'm overreacting. I'm thinking about this all the time, and it's if you tell someone, they might think you're just getting some text messages and some, ignore it. But on the other hand, you can be underreacting too because you just don't know how far someone is going to go. And as someone who works in that domestic violence space, I am really aware of how things can develop and escalate over time. And so, yeah, it was affecting me quite a lot, but from a lot of different perspectives, I guess. There's that personal aspect of this is emotionally draining, and it's also insulting and cruel. But I think the bigger problem is the fixation that someone has on you for such a long period of time, and the effort they're putting in and the intent behind those actions is the most alarming part, if that makes sense.
Of course. Well, you ended up contacting the police again about a year and a half in, so December 2019 timeline-wise. What made you do that? What made you reach out again and try and get help?
So the second time we called police was after I got those text messages. And the reason I did that was because my understanding at that point was because of the way the world had gone with terrorism and changes to laws and things like that, was that you can't get SIM cards anymore without putting your details in. That was my understanding. So I assumed that if I had told police what had happened and a little bit about the history, it would be easy for them to track down these SIMs and who owned those SIMs and then maybe go and have a talk to her.
Yeah.
That was my assumption at the time, but that's not the response that I got.
Well, they were pretty dismissive, weren't they?
Yeah. I mean, I don't think he was intentionally trying to be condescending, but that's how I felt. And I think especially when you're dealing with a female victim and a female perpetrator, it can have that, sensationalist tone to it. And when you're talking to someone and you can see that dismissive response, it makes you withdraw as well. So you end up underselling or minimizing what you're going through anyway. So the end result is kind of disastrous. But yeah, he basically said that sort of famous line, keep a diary, and if you're in danger, call 000.
Which you were already doing. You kept every single message.
I kept everything. And in the end, that's what saved me. But yeah, I was keeping everything in it.
Like a year and a half in, you've been getting messages like every day for periods of time, and you're just kind of told, deal with it on your own.
Yeah. So after that day, like I was really devastated after the police left that day, because I really felt like there's nothing I can do. I just have to put up with this for as long as it goes on.
And by this point, had she worked out where you lived?
At that particular point, when I called the police that second time, no, I didn't know anything about what she knew about me. But ultimately, when we moved, yeah, she did find out those more personal details, and it took that turn.
And how did she use those personal details to kind of increase her almost threats to you?
Yeah, it's important to note that in both the messages and the Instagram posts and the text, there was always that underlining threat that something was about to happen, that she was about to do something bigger or was about to reveal something else or involve someone else. So I was always quite on edge as to what was going to happen next. And sometimes something did and sometimes it didn't. But it effectively makes you feel like that person is there all the time and everywhere, and you're just waiting all the time to find out what's going to happen. But to answer your question about that personal information, that sort of happened over time towards the last 6 months of the stalking. So it really escalated on Instagram, and she started posting really personal information like my address online and details about my upcoming wedding, and also a couple of places that we'd been. So it had become really scary at that point.
Well, you became engaged in 2020.
Mm-hmm.
Did you post that online? How did she find out about it? And how did she react?
Well, yeah, we did post it online, as people do. She reacted to it with a flurry of posts. I want to say that it didn't make it any worse or any less severe. And I think it's really important when talking about this kind of crime is that a lot of times people think they've triggered a reaction in a stalker or same applies to domestic violence, where if only I hadn't have done that or if only I hadn't have said that. I've learned through research and experience that you don't control that person's behaviour, and really if that didn't trigger something, something else would have. So I think in her case, she just continued on.
You ended up connecting with another one of Karissa's victims. Tell us about how that evolved.
Yeah, so I was sitting on my couch doing some work and I got an Instagram message request, and I was kind of used to at that point getting those message requests and my heart sinking and thinking, oh, what now? Because that had happened quite a lot. She would often message me under her own name, but also under a series of other names as well. But when I read this message, this woman had said that she was a relative of Karissa's and that she had experienced a similar thing. She had identified me through her own detective work, I guess, in the way that Karissa was posting about me, and wanted to reach out basically to say, I know how you feel and I support what you're going through. And at that time, initially I was a little bit suspicious, like I wasn't sure if it was actually Karissa contacting me, to get me to kind of lower my guard. But I investigated that and it was clearly a specific person. And so I responded to that message, and she ended up being a real lifeline for me. It was incredibly validating to have someone say, I went through this and I'm terrified and I was really scared. And you could sense that fear in her even reaching out to me. And so I was really grateful.
What was her story? Obviously briefly, but what had Karissa been doing to her?
Same sorts of things. So heavy contact, lots of abusive messages and threats and things like that. This person believed that she was responsible for her losing her job, so she had contacted her workplace. When she was getting married, she had contacted the wedding venue to cancel it, things like that, and just sort of interfering in her life. And she had sort of caused a lot of estrangements within the family as well.
So you contacted the police again 2.5 years in, so 2.5 years of being stalked by this woman. And you contact police again, this time via a cybercrime report. How long did it take for them to actually start taking you seriously?
It was a long time, but that was a real turning point. So I sort of got the courage to do that after speaking to this other victim. It just validated that something bad was happening and that I should do something about it. Having those things posted online, particularly our address and knowing where we were going and things like that, I knew I couldn't just sit by and let it happen anymore. As someone with children and a family, I had to try something else. I think I tried the cybercrime because that allowed me to put everything in writing. I mean, it was a really
and you're
long,
a writer,
yeah,
so.
and it was a very long cybercrime report that I put in. So I was able to put things in order and list some dates and give some tangible examples of what I was going through. And ultimately, that got referred to my local police station. And I think I was really fortunate because I got a female police officer who really listened to me. But look, it probably took, several months before I got that call.
Once you have this great cop on your side, what's the next step? She has the report. She believes you. She wants to go after Karissa, but she has to basically get in touch with Karissa.
Yeah.
And that gets tricky.
Exactly. Well, a lot has to happen. So the first step was, the conversation. And I think from my perspective, hearing her response to what I was telling her, which was she was alarmed and she was treating me as a victim of crime. And that sort of gave me the courage to really explain in detail what was happening. She had to contact Karissa, yes, and that took several months also because she just wouldn't answer calls and wouldn't respond to knocks on the door and things like that. So it was quite frustrating. But at the same time, I was also asked to gather an extensive kind of dossier of evidence. And without that, we wouldn't have got anywhere.
She was eventually charged.
Yes.
How did you find out about that?
I got an email, basically. So I had put all of my evidence together in a little file and sent that to her. And she ultimately did get in touch with Karissa. And she let me know when she had got in touch and said that Karissa had said it was all a big misunderstanding, as expected, I suppose, which kind of caused me to panic a little bit. I really didn't think it was going to go any further than that. But yeah, maybe a month later, I got an email to say that she had been charged with unlawful stalking. When
you contacted police for this third time and they started taking it seriously, was that the first time the word stalking was used?
Yes. Yeah. So I personally hadn't attached that word to what was happening, but it was only when I was having a conversation with that policewoman and I said, what are you trying to achieve as you look into this? And she said, I think that we'll probably charge her with stalking. And that was when I first realised how serious it was, what was happening.
So that was 3 years in.
3 years in.
3 years in. Karissa gets charged with stalking. I don't know if anyone here has been to court. Don't recommend. But that is also a long process.
The court hearing didn't actually take place for probably another 6 months because she was able to continue to adjourn those initial proceedings.
Was she contacting you in that 6 months?
In that 6 months, no. That was a really, and everything got deleted from her pages and it was a quiet 6 months. And that was sort of around the time I got married.
And how did court play out? You had to be there?
I didn't have to be there because it's essentially police charging her. So I don't have to be there. I chose to go there. I went there with my mum. I just wanted to get that sense of closure around it. But it was kind of really nerve-wracking because I hadn't actually come face-to-face with her since that day at the
Oh, that would have been so nerve-wracking. Tell us about the moment she walked in.
Yeah, so it was really strange because it was during COVID, so we all had masks on. And Mum and I sat through an entire day of court proceedings and they were all domestic violence cases. And it was just an interestingly shocking, horrible thing to witness in itself. That's a whole other story. But so she was the last case of that day. So we'd been sitting there all day. And she walks in through the door and literally, as she gets to my feet, stops, must have sort of clocked that I was there and just stares at me for, it felt like seconds, but it was probably just half a second. And then walks on and sits down and she didn't turn back after that.
How did it feel?
Yeah, awful. Yeah, it was a really strange feeling, really hard to describe.
This is not the kind of wording that you put into court.
Yeah, it was just sort of like on this dodgy piece of paper.
But going back to the court proceedings where it is about Karissa, she's been charged, she's before a judge. Did she try and give a defence? What was her excuse to the court?
It was really awful being in court because obviously I'm sitting there just listening and her lawyer on her behalf sort of started to give her version of the story, which a lot of it was just sort of false things anyway. So I could feel my heart beating and there's nothing I can do about it. But she sort of justified it as she was like a hurt person and was just reacting to that and tried to sort of just really diminish it. But I was very fortunate that the judge that was there that day was very dismissive of her and really supportive of what I had written in my victim impact statement and ultimately asked me a couple of questions on the day, which was really nerve-wracking, but it was also really positive in the end because I was able to articulate things a lot better than the prosecutor on the day.
Well, the prosecutor hadn't even kind of put forward a desire or like spoken to you about what to do.
No, it was like, to be honest, the entire day of court was a fiasco, in my opinion. Like there was, including all the cases before mine, all these domestic violence cases, and I can see why there's such terrible outcomes for women all the time. But yeah, the prosecutors, I think the police do all this work and then they hand it over, and it's up to the prosecutor how much they read and how much they put forward on the day. And mine put very little, but the judge was very open to hearing more. Yeah, ultimately she was the one that recommended the restraining order.
So what was the sentence? She got a 2-year restraining order?
She got a 2-year restraining order and a 2-year probation order. So ultimately she pleaded guilty, and that was the sentence that she got.
Were you happy with that?
Well, yes and no. Obviously, when you go through something like that, I think everyone would hope for a more serious consequence. But having been sitting there all that day, the 5 or 6 men that went before her who had breached domestic violence orders in really, really serious ways and often multiple times, none of those people got jail time, and the maximum sentence that was given out that day was a 2-year probation order. So with that in mind, I was happy.
So you probably weren't even expecting that.
No.
You're probably expecting.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
Yeah, I said to my mum, we're going to be laughed out of this place.
Well, thank goodness you weren't.
No.
Did it work? Did she stop contacting you?
Well, she couldn't contact me at all for 2 years or post anything about me or come near my home or anything like that. And those things were all adhered to my knowledge. I guess the thing about stalking is that because it goes for such a prolonged period of time before anything happens, there's a lot of time to kind of develop almost a shared language between the two of you, so that by the end you're able to send messages that no one else can really decode except you. So the downside of that is stalkers can learn over time and with these legal proceedings that happen how to send their messages without breaking any laws, if that makes sense.
So she was doing that?
Yeah.
How?
Yes.
Like with Instagram posts that weren't tagging you, that were subtle?
Yeah, correct. I mean, and they certainly died off for a really long time. So she closed down all her social media for a little while. There was an article that went into the paper after that court
About her?
case. Yeah, there was obviously a journalist in the courtroom. Nothing to do with me. It was just we saw it the next day. And yeah, everything shut down and it went quiet for quite a while. But yeah, over time, posts did start to come back, and she did find ways to let me know that she's still there and aware of what I'm doing.
You've written a book on your experience, and you didn't just look at your own experience. You kind of looked at stalking more broadly across Australia. What did you discover about it? How common is it? Is it men? Is it women?
Yeah, so it's really common. So about 25% of women will be stalked at some stage in their life, and about 1 in 8 men. I wanted to research it because I think, I was really intrigued, I suppose, at the purpose behind it, what motivates someone to do this for such a long period of time. In my case, obviously in the beginning, it seemed like she just wants to break up a relationship. But after quite a long period of time, when that was we were well past that stage, she didn't stop and seemed more intent than ever to try to cause trouble. But I was just always wondered, what needs to happen to me for this to stop? What needs to happen? So that's why I investigated it. But I think, it's a really, really common crime. And what's also common is that people don't talk about it. They keep it to themselves.
Well, there are many different types of stalkers, and I want to touch on a few of them. To start with Karissa, an expert told you, after you told your story, that she was what you would call a resentful stalker?
Yes.
What does that mean?
Yeah, so there are 5 different typologies, and they were developed by an Australian professor, actually, but they're generally considered worldwide now. So a resentful stalker is someone who's stalking for the purpose of revenge or retribution. So they feel angry, basically, about something, and their goal in their stalking is to cause damage to that other person.
And take us through the other 4 quickly.
So there's the rejected stalker, which is a really commonly found stalking in domestic violence cases. So someone who's been rejected in some way, whether that be most commonly by a partner, but it could be by a workplace, they've lost their job or something like that. So their goal in their stalking is to rekindle that relationship, but that can often then develop into a resentful response anyway, because if they don't get that reconciliation that they're after, then they become angry. Another type is what is known as an incompetent suitor. That's someone who you'd find stalking a celebrity or someone of a higher status. And it's more commonly associated with people with mental illnesses and things like that because they've sort of conjured up a relationship in their mind and might feel like the Queen is also in love with them or sort of the man who stalked Delta Goodrem who believed that they were in some sort of relationship.
Which is a kind of stalking that we would see a lot of headlines about.
Yes. Yeah, that's the kind that people tend to think of.
Mm-hmm.
Then there is one called the intimacy seeker, and that is basically someone who's met someone and they want to either sleep with them or start a relationship with them. And that stalking might be more short term. So they're just harassing that person and stalking them over a shorter period of time. And then the final one is the predatory stalker, which we also see in movies, which might be a stranger who's literally is hiding around in the bushes and is more likely to ultimately lead to a physical attack.
Which probably is not as common.
Far less common.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you've kind of alluded to this, but stalking is a precursor or it exists in pretty much all domestic violence cases or a lot of domestic violence cases. And some of the most famous that you might remember in the audience is Hannah Clark. Hannah Clark, she had stalking as part of her case. Celeste Mano, which was a Sydney woman.
Yeah.
All have stalking as part of their story.
Yeah, that's right. And those two cases are really interesting because in Hannah Clark's case, that was a domestic violence case and the stalking that had happened with him was quite prolonged and she had reported those behaviours. But again, not a lot was done about that. And in domestic violence murders, stalking is incredibly common. In Celeste's case, she didn't know this man at all. So it's a really interesting case to look at for non-domestic violence stalking, which is an element of stalking in Australia in particular that's not really looked at, and there are not a lot of protections or support for people who are stalked from someone who is not a current or former partner.
What really shocked me, which I found out in your book, is that stalking only became illegal in Australia in 1993.
I interviewed the expert who developed those 5 typologies, Paul Mullen, and he sort of described it as an old behaviour but a new crime.
An old behaviour but a new crime. Well, I guess the woman who stalked you used technology. So has technology escalated everything?
It's changed it and made it easier, and it's enabled people to be anonymous, I guess, and get away with a lot more. So it's easier. On top of that, it's enabled people to engage in those behaviours far more frequently. So during COVID, stalking escalated quite dramatically, the research shows.
Really?
Yeah, and that's because I guess people have more time on their hands and they can do it.
To stalk?
Yeah, they can do it. So because interestingly, like in my case as well, when you see the text or the comments or the whatever it is that's however they're communicating, there's no pattern to it and it happens at all times of the day or night, which makes you think whenever this person has free time, this is what they're engaging in. So in times like COVID, if you've got someone who's developed an obsession of some kind, there's all this time for that obsession to mushroom and grow and expand. And technology allows us to do that at any time of day.
You have interviewed dozens, probably hundreds nearly, of victim survivors who have all had different stories within those 5 categories. How many of those have actually seen convictions?
Very few. It's very difficult to get a conviction for a number of reasons. So stalking is illegal. It is a crime and you're not allowed to do it. But it's really difficult to prove and there's not a lot of understanding about what it is and the nuances around it within the community or within the police force as well. Because, and this, again, I'm sort of paraphrasing what the experts have told me here, but when it comes to police, they're sort of used to dealing with crimes that have happened, whereas stalking is a crime that's ongoing and it's made up of a series of often legal behaviours that in isolation aren't particularly alarming. So if you go in to report unwanted flowers at your door, for example, you'll probably get told, make a note of things, keep a diary and all of that. So if you go ahead and do that and then you go back to the police station and it's a different police officer, you're going to get the same kind of response. So without that education and guidance, there's really not a lot of support for those victims.
So it's all about documentation.
It's very much about documentation. I think attitudes also play into this as well because all the research shows that generally society views stalking as something that's either not very serious, possibly a bit romantic, and often victims are to blame in some way because of their behaviour or what they are or aren't doing. So with all of that, it just makes for a really difficult situation.
Who's watched Baby Reindeer on Netflix? Yeah, the whole room. It was the top grossing on Netflix for a reason. If you forget what it was about, it was the true story of a barman/comedian who was stalked by a patron. And you've described that show as a masterclass in stalking. Expand on that, because there's so much content out there. Often the predatory stalking is on screen. Why were you so impressed by this depiction?
Yeah, I've watched a lot of movies about stalking, and everyone likes to watch them. They're interesting to watch, and there's always a real sameness about them when there's either a really scary male stalker or a, really unhinged female stalker who ultimately they end up getting physically violent at the end. When I saw the first opening scene of Baby Reindeer, where he goes into the police station, he's sort of embarrassed and he's got that sort of coy look on his face. Then he shows a message and it says something like, "I ate an egg." And the police officer's looking at him like, what are you doing here? And why did you wait so long to come in? So as soon as I saw that opening scene, I'm like, this is a realistic depiction of stalking. His face, the police reaction, the whole thing. And I think the way that played out, where he was so honest with his mixed emotions. So until you know someone's stalking you, you don't know they're going to stalk you. So it may take weeks, it could take months, it could take years before you suddenly go, I'm scared now. It just depends on the situation. So I think he articulated that really well.
And I mean, we showed the text messages at the start. You could see that they were so similar to the kind of wording and like lowercase and like the strangeness of
just the strangeness of it and being able to send a message without sending a message the longer it goes on. In his case, after 6 months, she might write, something that seems innocuous to somebody else, but he knows what it means.
I want to give some positive things that have happened in the world of stalking, because we've done a lot of negativity. Coercive control laws, they've recently passed in Queensland. How are they going to help this kind of thing?
There's a lot of similarities between coercive control and stalking, and I think the biggest similarity is the fact that it's a series of behaviours, often legal behaviours and patterns of behaviours. And those laws that have come into play, I think, really are a direct result of people talking more and sharing stories and speaking out about it. So the more people understand and are educated, the more change that happens. I guess, in terms of stalking, though, it is already a crime. It's just awareness and attitudes that need to change.
Erin Molan, media commentator, she's also done a lot in this space.
Yeah, again, really similar. So her main focus was trolling, which has a lot of similarities to stalking because it's often done online and people, again, they underestimate the impact of stalking. So I think, and trolling as well. And I think she did an incredible job of talking about how much it impacted her in the face of a lot of ridicule and, the embarrassment and humiliation that comes around talking about it, because both stalking and trolling, it's often very distasteful content and it's not something that a lot of people feel comfortable talking about.
So it's like we're getting there with little bits.
We're getting there, I think. And I think we're talking about stalking a lot. I mean, I've seen it talked about a lot more in the last couple of years, and particularly in relation to domestic violence.
Karissa's restraining order expired in early 2024. Were you nervous?
Yeah, I was really nervous because I'd been made aware of sort of like a little countdown that she'd set up on social media that wasn't specific, like I wasn't mentioned or anything like that, but the date was mentioned.
Yeah, right.
So I was aware that it was coming up and that she was aware it was coming up. So I was conscious of it.
And when that date did come up, what happened? Or what's happened since? Is she contacting you?
No, she's not contacting me at all. So direct contact has stopped and public posts or anything that directly mention me, those things have all stopped. So that's been a really positive outcome of all of this. There's two elements, I guess, to my experience. One was just the fear of the public humiliation that came with it and being constantly harassed all the time. So that has stopped. But there have been social media posts and similar things like that that have let me know that she's still watching what I'm doing. And I guess the most significant thing that has happened since then was a post she put out saying that she was moving to the street that was adjacent to mine, naming the street online. And that sort of, made me anxious, of course.
Do you think she's moved? Or was it a threat?
I don't know. I have any evidence to suggest that she has moved into the area, but what it has caused for me is that not knowing.
Yeah.
She went as far as posting a photo of, a menu from a local takeaway store. So there's some effort that's gone into that. So even though it's not public or it's not direct, I still am aware that there's a person out there still fixating on this 6 years later. And it's a really uncomfortable and
6
disconcerting
years.
feeling.
And like, you didn't know this woman. It's just wild to try and comprehend. Does it make your experience now that she's still doing it different though? Because when it first happened to you, you were very isolated. You weren't telling anyone apart from your partner and your mum. But now you're sitting on a stage talking to people. You've got a book. When you do stuff like this, does it make you nervous that she's going to kind of give you a barrage of messages or?
It's really strange because I've been asked that a lot, especially since I wrote the book. This is my experience only because I'm always very conscious of people's safety. So everybody's experience is going to be different. And for some people, speaking publicly about things can be dangerous. And we've unfortunately seen that sometimes, as we know with domestic violence, when people leave their relationships, it's the most dangerous time. But at the same time, that doesn't mean we encourage people to stay either. So it's complicated. But in my case, since I stopped being silent and alone, it's reduced things for me and it's empowered me a lot as well. And I think I've been contacted by dozens and dozens of people who have had similar experiences, and they report feeling so much better having read about someone else's experience, but they're also giving that same validation to me. And I've been fortunate enough to have that many people validate how I feel. And I think there is a strength in numbers. Yeah. And when we're all talking about things publicly, that takes away the power of perpetrators who thrive off fear and silence.
What would your advice be if there was anyone in this audience that is at the early stages and they think they might be getting stalked? What would you say to them to try and nip this in the bud early? Yeah, 2 really important things. The first thing is to record absolutely everything from the moment you feel uncomfortable, because I think importantly, nobody can predict that something is going to evolve into stalking. Someone might just send you 4 or 5 nasty messages and you never hear from them again, but it's critical to record from the second that you feel uncomfortable. If you never have to use them, then it doesn't matter. But if it does escalate, you've got the evidence to say this is a pattern, because that's the critical part of stalking, a pattern of behaviour. The second thing I would say is to tell somebody, anybody, whether it's a friend, a family member, a therapist, or the police, tell somebody. That's for a couple of reasons. It will help you, of course, anyway, but it's also for your own safety. If things do escalate or change or evolve, somebody knows that that person is out there. And I think secondly to that, when you do tell someone, chances are they will be dismissive, but then tell somebody else. If you keep talking and telling someone will eventually listen to you. And I think that's the main thing to remember. If you'd like to hear more from Nicole, please go and get her book. It's called Obsession. You can get it at any good bookstore or you can listen to it on Audible. And if you liked this episode, we've got 200 episodes that you can go and listen to on the True Crime Conversations feed. You can get it wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much to Nicole for being my guest today.